welcome to the sideboard here at the Star City Games Pioneer Open in Indianapolis, part of the SCG Tour, brought to you by Ultimate Guard and Carnox Chairs. I'm Nick Miller alongside Edgar Magalhaes, Team Lotus Box's own history maker in Richmond with 4 straight open top 8s or top 4s, and we're going for 5 this weekend.
I'm 5, trying to excel that lead.
First one to ever do it. How you feeling coming into this weekend?
Feeling pretty good. Obviously wasn't here last week or 2 weeks ago for the Open because of the Pro Tour, but in a decent spot still, and I'm hoping to cement my lead a little bit more.
Right, and we're talking about Sultai Delirium here today. Notably, you played the Demir Inverter deck in Phoenix. Not a bad finish, 33rd place there. So how come you've changed to this deck?
Yeah, I also played Inverter at the last Open as well, and the reason I ended up changing is because the metagame is kind of becoming more and more inbred, in my opinion. And honestly, I just really love a good mid-range deck. And the fact that there's just a playable one in this format right now, like it's hard for me to shy away from that.
Right, when I ask anyone why they're on this deck, they mostly say that. It's
a lot of fun.
It's a good mid-range deck, and I get to play it and have a bunch of fun.
Yeah.
And I have matchups that you can win and work around if they're bad. So. Typical mid-range cards here. We have removal spells and discards, so we have Thoughtseize, Fatal Push to start off the curve. We have other removal spells and Abrupt Decay, and Murderous Rider, and Eat to Extinction here. But notably, Jerry Thompson on the premium side of Star City Games talked about a version of this deck without Traverse.
Yeah.
You are still on the Traverse camp, as is most of the people you worked with that are playing this deck. Talk to us why you are still on Traverse.
Sure. So when you cut Traverse from the deck, you kind of need to add mana sources because it's kind of built into your mana base a little bit. And that was something that I felt like I didn't really want to do, because if you're going to cut Traverse for lands, play more mana sources, I'm personally just okay with the fact that my Traverse is going to find a basic land like 70% of the time, 80% of the time. Like I know I get a land a lot with it. It's good with your Jaces, it's good with your trackers. But the small percentage of the time where you do use it to tutor up a creature it can sometimes be game ending, and I think having access to that is pretty important. That being said, part of the reason people were advocating for cutting it is because they want to play like the Emrakul, the Walking Ballista, but I think you can still build your deck without those cards, but it just still incorporate Traverse the Open Wall. I personally think that card is very powerful. Right,
and you still have the Ballista and the Emrakul in your deck. What are the pros and cons for having these cards in the deck? Of course, with the package of Traverse.
Right, so you have a lot of virtual copies of cards like that, and when that's relevant, it's really, really powerful. Like when you need to find your Ishkana against Spirits, that's really good. Personally, I think that without Emrakul, you're going to lose a lot of equity in the mirror matches, which I expected to be fairly prevalent this weekend, and that wasn't really something I wanted to have access to, or not have access to, rather. So that would be like the downside of cutting it. But then obviously the upside is you're going to be more streamlined. You got to play more cards like Grizzly Salvage to more consistently do like your Uro tracker thing every game, and you're going to get the upside that side.
Right. You of course have the Satyr Wayfinders here. You have 1 grapple with the Pest. You said this has some upside to it over the Grizzly Salvage that some people are playing.
Right, yeah. So most people have like 1 or 2 Grizzly Salvages when they're still playing the Traverse. I opted to play 1 copy of Grapple with the Past, and the reason I wanted to do that was because the deck was actually fairly bad at returning Emrakul from your graveyard. Most lists have like 1 copy of Liliana. I'm playing a Tamiyo instead this weekend. But outside of that, if you mill over your Emrakul with Satyr Wayfinder, you actually struggle to get it back. And in all the matchups where I really wanted access to that card, I wanted to be able to do that. So by cutting Grizzly Salvage for Grapple with the Past, it turns all of your Jaces into Emrakuls in the late game. You got to Jace back the Grizzly Salvage, and then Grizzly Salvage, or the Grapple with the Past, and then Grapple past the Emrakul. And it gives you a lot more virtual copies in the late game for your powerful card.
All right. The other notable thing here, 4 copies of Uro. How does this deck balance fueling Uro while keeping Delirium a thing for Traverse and for making Emrakul castable and that kind of stuff?
It can be really awkward some games. Sometimes you have to delve types and then hope you draw those types again later on. For the most part, it's not really that big of a deal. You can like Traverse first before casting your Uro, like change your sequencing around if it's going to affect it. But for the most part, you don't really mind that much. If you're putting Uro into play, you're doing a powerful thing. You're affecting the board. You're going to continue to play a normal game of Magic, and eventually you'll get Delirium back online.
Right. Planeswalker suite here. We have 3 Jace, Vryn's Prodigy. I mean, creature technically,
Sure,
but flips
yeah.
into a Planeswalker. We have 2 Nissa and 1 Tamiyo. You said you're opting for Tamiyo over Liliana. And what about the Nissas here? They seem sort of out of place in this deck
They
because
do,
you're not really
yeah.
ramping, but
It's kind of subtly good. I was kind of shocked to see it in the deck at first. Like you said, it kind of looks out of place. But the more you play with it, the more you realize that like it's kind of just a really good role player in the deck. It's really good at combating graveyard hate after board. When you curve like Tracker and a Nissa and your opponent has a Rest in Peace, you kind of get to embarrass them. And the deck is very capable of using the extra mana. Even if it's only producing like 2 extra mana each turn, maybe 3 extra mana, you still got to take advantage of that using your Uro, using your Tracker clues, and ramping to Emrakul as well. It's been pretty impressive, and originally I actually only had 1 copy, and I went up to 2 because of that.
right. Then your mid-range suite of creatures, you've got 2 Courser, 2 Tracker with another Tracker in the board. What's the split there?
You want to diversify. Courser's main thing is the fact that it's an enchantment, actually. It's kind of a little bit mopey sometimes. When it's good, it's actually great. Like, the life gain is really relevant against the aggressive decks. It's good against mono black. But the fact that it's an enchantment comes up a lot. Like we were talking about earlier with the Uro, being able to keep 1 card in your graveyard, but it represents 2 types can come up a lot, especially if you have like exactly 5 or 6 cards in your graveyard. So that's pretty useful sometimes. And you just don't really want to overload on Tracker. It can be a little slow against some of the more aggressive decks, and you would rather just have a split, I think.
Okay. We have the Ishkanai, as you mentioned, as your other target. You have your Eat to Extinction for your exile effects, and then you have the 1 Ipnu Rivulet just hanging out in the mana base, just for some headaches for the Dimir Inverter deck.
Kind of had to warp the mana a little bit to do that, but we kind of got away with that by cutting more of the double black spells from the deck. We got rid of the Liliana, like we were talking about earlier. I think that the 1 Ipnu is probably going to come up quite a few times. There's going to be a lot of Dimir Inverter this weekend, we can only assume. So just being able to traverse for that, it can be game winning a lot of the time.
How do you like your matchup spread? Obviously, you had played Inverter at the previous 2 events. How do you like this deck position this weekend?
I think that the Inverter matchup is close. It's probably honestly unfavored in a vacuum, but there's a lot of play to it, so I don't feel too bad about facing most people playing it. And this deck honestly just kind of destroys everything that's trying to beat Inverter. Breach can also be tough, but we have a lot of tools in the sideboard to beat that. But like all of the aggressive decks, they kind of just feel like really free with this deck. It's very difficult for a lot of those decks to just beat the card Uro on its own.
Right. Does this deck have any action or, I guess, interaction for a quick Dimir Inverter combo? Or are you just kind of weak to that if they just have it?
In game 1, you can be weak to it. You have some discard spells. It depends on how they're comboing. Fastest Oracle can actually be more annoying in game 1, even though it becomes less annoying after board. Because if they Oracle with no cards in their deck, you kind of just don't really have any way to interact with that. But if they go too fast and you have access to Delirium, you can sometimes get them with the Ipnu. And if they're relying on Jace, you can sometimes get them with the Murder Strider or the Eat with the Extinction.
Okay. We'll move to the sideboard here. 3 copies of Leyline for the graveyard matchups, and then you have only 2 copies of Damping Sphere. I've seen a lot of people say you need a lot of copies of this card for the Lotus Breach combo or the matchup.
Right.
Are you just relying on 2 plus Traverse, or to find it?
You can't Traverse for this, but we do have 2 copies of Unmoored Ego as well, which overlaps there. And Unmoored Ego is part of our plan against the Dimir Inverter deck as well. So we have a split there. And I think although Damping Sphere is really powerful out of, say, Inverter against Lotus Breach, it's less good out of this deck, where interacting against them with Ego, Leyline, and Mystical Dispute feels a little bit better. But we do have the spread so that we can draw like a variety of interaction against them, because coming at them in multiple angles is really relevant. If you play too many of these, you get got by Blast Zone, I think. Okay.
Then we have 2 copies of Sultai Charm, Blast from the Past here. This thing's doing it all.
Yeah, I mean, I like a good modal card. I love charms, if anyone knows me. So, like, the biggest reason for this card existing in the sideboard is the fact that it's a disenchant. This deck obviously struggles against stuff like Rest in Peace and Leyline of the Void, but the fact that this is a disenchant that is never dead is really relevant, because when you board it in against stuff like Spirits, when you board it in the mirror, it can be really embarrassing. Like, if you had actual disenchant, it would be really embarrassing if you just like got Uro'd instead and they don't have a Leyline, or you just died to a curve of creatures from Spirits. So like this being a Terminate, an ultimate price, as well as sometimes you gotta just catalog people, just filter your draws, find your good stuff when they don't have their hate card.
Right. Rest of the board here is filled out with one-ofs. You have an Agonizing Remorse here as extra discard, another tracker as we mentioned, Hostage Taker as another traverse target here. What are we looking to take?
It's mostly for the aggressive decks. It's good against the Ensoul deck as well, just being able to get their Darksteel Citadels, which you can struggle against in game one sometimes. And then it's also relevant in the mirror, just good in the grindy matchups sometimes.
Sure. And another Abrupt Decay as a piece of removal.
Yeah, Abrupt Decay plus Tracker ends up being our board plan against a lot of the decks. Just they try to combat or attack your graveyard, and you just get them with Tracker. It's a really powerful card in this deck.
Okay. In your testing, what have you seen the format shake up as now? Because I've seen a lot of rise in the SRAM deck. Mono black, mono red is popping up. How do you feel about the format in general and where you're at?
Yeah, it feels like a bunch of people playing Inverter and Breach, and then building their decks to beat each other, but still have game against the decks that are attacking them, like the mono blacks and stuff like that. So there's this like weird balance where they're trying to play as many like main deck Mystical Disputes and Narsets and stuff to like try to keep up with each other, but like not get destroyed by the aggro decks. So it's kind of like the metagame is like built around that, and then this is kind of coming in and attacking the aggro decks and trying to like capitalize on the fact that they're there.
All right, well, we're in round 2 here. You have 2 buys from a great start and obviously a great year last year. We're looking for 5 in a row.
5 in a row.
Corey can catch you at 4 in a row.
You can try.
But I got to say, it's going to be exciting to watch you this weekend. Best of luck,
Thank
Edgar.
you.
Stay tuned to Star City Games all weekend long for the action here in Indianapolis.